I want you to imagine a politician. This politician is an extreme nationalist, racist, and anti-Semite. About as far as you can go in that direction. In his early days in politics, he is helped by other individuals and groups of the far right. He allies with far-right groups to try and overthrow the state, but fails miserably. Nevertheless, he manages to escape harsh punishment for his coup attempt due to the judge being biased in favor of the right. Now, this politician builds political alliances with conservatives and nationalists and wins the votes of millions of right-wing voters, previously fractured between competing parties. This politician is maneuvered into power by a shady conservative cabal of army officers, businessmen, and establishment figures, and continues to collaborate with these types throughout his time in office while brutally crushing the political left. On the international stage, he makes alliances with right-wing and reactionary regimes across the globe, and he takes control of almost every aspect of national life in order to totally mobilize his country and economy for a genocidal war of conquest against races he deems inferior. Now, imagine people 80 years later concluding that this politician was in fact left-wing, despite all the evidence and scholarship positing the opposite view, and the fact contemporaries to this politician would have found such an assertion so ridiculous that they didn't even discuss it. Have these modern revisionists really uncovered a hidden truth that even members of his own party did not seem to realize? Or are they, in fact, victims of history's worst misconception? Hello and welcome to episode 12 of History's Worst Misconception. My name is Peter.
And I'm Alex, and today our episode, I think, is going to be, we said it last time, it's going to be a bit different because it was an interview, wasn't it? But this time it's going to be a bit different because we're not telling a story, we're not telling a narrative like we usually do. We are more focused on that kind of history meta, if you like. We are looking at a misconception in history. We are debunking it.
It's going to be a little bit more conversational than normal. You'll hear a lot more from me than you normally do, because we've had conversations in the past about this. And every time we do, we have a good amount of things to say, and it annoys me. It annoys me that
Well, yeah. Given the origins of this podcast were our conversations about history and wanting to put them out there, if you like, this is almost like going back to our roots.
Yeah, pretty much. Which is, I'm happy with that. So, what is history's worst misconception?
Well, something that appears to be growing, unfortunately, in terms of a misconception, a false idea about history, is the idea that the Nazis, Hitler's National Socialist German Workers' Party, was left-wing or was socialist.
Yeah. Now, I think a lot of the misconception probably comes from the fact that the Nazis' official party name is the National Socialist Party. Now, would you call North Korea a democratic people's republic?
Yeah, it's not exactly a unique example of a political title not being entirely representative of what actually it represents. I think what people who maybe make this mistake don't realize is that it's very specific to the context of the time and place. So in 1918 to 20, you had numerous German far-right groups using the language of socialism.
Yeah.
And there was a very specific reason for that. It's because in 1918-19, there was the German Revolution, where the Kaiser and the establishment were overthrown by a mass socialist revolution. And that spawned the Weimar Republic. Now, this obviously was a traumatic event for a lot of Germans, losing the First World War and then a revolution. We talked about it all in episode 1, didn't we, about Ludendorff. But a lot of people on the German right, nationalists, particularly the far right, what might be termed the Volkisch right, mourned the fact that the working class of Germany seemed to have abandoned patriotism, abandoned nationalism, abandoned allegiance to the monarchy, and gone over to these Marxist ideas, either socialism, social democracy, or communism. And you saw actually from the kind of late stages of the First World War a trend of far-right groups to try and a deliberate attempt to try and win back the working class by using the language of socialism. Now, you had, for example, a group on the German far right called the German Socialist Party. And I can see where people might go wrong, but it was, it definitely used anti-capitalist rhetoric, but fundamentally at its heart, it was a racist, anti-Semitic party. You have to look at the founders of the Nazi Party, Anton Drexler, Dietrich Eckart, and obviously along comes Adolf Hitler to join them. And what fundamentally was their kind of view? Well, they had something in common in that they were, the movement, the German Workers' Party that became the Nazi Party was started by Anton Drexler. Consciously, he was not hiding this, of an attempt to win the working class back to nationalist politics. And you then kind of the party takes shape in this very specific context of, in the aftermath of the German Revolution in 1919, 1920, of it's an attempt, and that's why so rich donors gave money to the Nazi Party in the early days, and it got sympathy and backing from the nationalist far right, was because they saw Adolf Hitler as this rabble-rouser of, well, he's going to get the workers back on our side. They weren't afraid of him as a socialist revolutionary. They thought he's going to bring the workers back to the right. In fact, the reason Hitler went to a Nazi Party meeting for the very first time was he was sent there by the army to check up on whether this was a dangerous left-wing group. And he wrote reports for the army very clearly saying, there's nothing to worry about. These guys have good, strong nationalist ideas.
Yeah. And that's the German Workers' Party. I mean, it's very specific to the context, and it's marketing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, the other thing that a lot of people would point to is A, the name, and B, the Nazi Party program, the 25-point program. Now, that in it does contain a number of policies that you definitely would look at and say, well, that's anti-capitalist, that's kind of socialist rhetoric. But again, it was actually written and published in February 1920, right? Very, very early on in the life of the Nazi Party. Hitler had only been a member for a few months. The program remained technically the Nazi Party program throughout its existence. But by the time they got into power, 13 years later, the principles of the program were not really relevant anymore. I mean, how many political parties can you think of that implement a program from 13 years before? You know, when you come up with a manifesto for an election, you don't then use when you get elected, the one you used 13 years ago.
Exactly.
More importantly, the points in it that are often quoted as socialist, it talks about land redistribution, taking land off the aristocrats, giving it to the peasants. It talks about worker control over, big business. It talks about the idea that you shouldn't be able to earn income from, interest. Everyone should work for their income. Now, famously, the Nazi Party came to power, and Hitler was dictator of Germany for 12 years. Did they do any of those things?
Well, yeah. It's a matter of what is said versus what is done. And I mean, if you can look at the tenets and you can look at all the things that the Nazis said they stood for, but I mean, if they don't do it in practice, it doesn't matter.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you can say in your program, we're going to redistribute the land, but if you don't do it,
there's no point. You're not.
That isn't the smoking gun of, oh, well, the Nazis were socialists. Well, they didn't redistribute the land. They didn't hand over industry to worker control. They didn't ban interest. And I'll tell you what, when the Nazis really broke through politically, 1930, through to 1933, when they finally get into power, they weren't putting up this 25-point program on their posters. They weren't mentioning it in their speeches because it was 10 years old and it was a failed attempt to attract the workers. I mean, any kind of historian, I mean, we'll probably end up repeating this point, but if anyone can seriously out there find me a historian or a political scientist who's written about the Nazi Party arguing that they're left-wing, please do, drop me a line on Twitter or drop us an email, because I am not aware of any.
David Irving. Actually, I don't know. Does he believe?
I don't think David Irving does.
Okay.
I think he might be a Holocaust denier, but I think he's very right-wing. In which case, his kind of sympathies for the Nazis wouldn't make any sense. Let me quote an actual historian who hasn't been thrown out of his profession for faulty work about the Nazi Party program. And by the way, this is all made very clear, and I'm not going to be ashamed of saying this, on the Wikipedia article of the Nazi Party program. Now, if you actually sat down and read it, which is more than a lot of people on Reddit might have done, you would be really clear about, this is a propaganda piece from 1920 that doesn't actually show us what the Nazi Party believed. Anyway, this historian, Karl Dietrich Bracher, says, to Hitler, the program was little more than an effective, persuasive propaganda weapon for mobilizing and manipulating the masses. Once it had brought him to power, it became pure decoration. It was unalterable, yet unrealized in its demands for nationalization, expropriation of property, land reform, breaking the shackles of finance capital. None of this, was done, is his point. So if none of it was done, it doesn't really show us what the Nazis stood for, because clearly these points, these policies were not important to them if they didn't do it. Like we said, they had total power. It was a dictatorship. They could have done these things, but they didn't, and they didn't want to, and they didn't talk about even doing it from the kind of late 20s onwards.
Exactly. They didn't want to do it because it's not what they actually believed in. It was against what they actually believed in, but they did it to gain voters and gain win back the left.
Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of it is to do with I mean, I've seen people describe the Nazis as a blue collar movement. Nothing really could be further from the truth.
Oh yeah, I mean, when you look at
all the leading
all
Nazis,
the leading Nazis are they are upper class. They are not working class.
They are either upper class, or a broad swathe of them were kind of middle class, often kind of lower middle class, bureaucrats, officials, small business owners, petty bourgeoisie. If you take a list of Nazis, the top Nazis: Himmler, Goebbels, Röhm, Hess, Strasser, Bormann, Frick, Streicher, Speer, Fritz Todt, Hitler himself. They're almost all from exactly the same social strata, which is kind of the lower middle class.
Yeah.
You had a few like Goering, von Ribbentrop, who were proper aristocrats or upper class. Now, a common trend with fascism across Europe is it tends to be a middle class response to the rise of communism and socialism. It's driven by middle class fear of the organized working class and of the Russian Revolution. Again, something we talked about, I think, in our first episode. And the Nazi Party fits that model perfectly. It is fundamentally made up of the bourgeoisie, of the sons of, teachers, of the sons of officials, of the sons of small business owners. It's not a working class movement. And although the Nazis, were very successful electorally, and in that sense must have attracted voters from all classes, actually, when you look at the data, overwhelmingly the voters that the Nazi Party attracted were right-wing, were middle class, were conservative. And again, why would millions of middle class and conservative Germans switch allegiance to the Nazi Party if they were a left-wing party? It doesn't make any sense.
This party doesn't have your interests in mind. You've never seen them, say that they have your interests in mind. It's written on the pamphlet, but is that what they're doing?
And by the time they made this breakthrough, like I said, they weren't making a big deal out of their 25-point program. If you want to, you can see this for yourself. Again, go on, look up the election results for 3 elections, and it'll show you the trend. 1928, the Nazi Party was really in the doldrums. They got, I think, 6 seats in the Reichstag, something like that. They weren't a major political force. 12 seats, I'm sorry. Double it. It's 2.6% of the vote. That's where I was confused. Now, in 1930, they made a big breakthrough. They shot up to 107 seats. Now, what you'd be looking at is, well, where have those seats come from? Who has switched their allegiance? Who previously was voting for one party is now voting for the Nazis? Well, in that election, the Social Democrats, the moderate left party, their vote did fall slightly. They lost 10 seats. But the Nazis gained 95. And the Communists gained 23. So they're not attracting Communists. And more than likely, those 10 lost by the Social Democrats, most of those votes are going to the Communists. So which parties suffer when the Nazis do well? That's what you've got to ask yourself if you want to kind of prove this to yourself. Which parties suffer? Well, the DNVP, the Nationalists, lost 32 seats. The DVP, the kind of Conservative Party, lost 15 seats.
I'm seeing a theme developing here.
Overall, the right in the Weimar Republic was really divided. There was lots of small rightist parties, which is actually one of the reasons the Nazis did so well, is they unified the rightist vote. But in that election, roughly, they lose about 50 seats to the other right-wing parties. And there's a big gain for the Nazis. You look at the Nazi, their best electoral performance was in July 1932, in a free election at least. Look at that election. They surge. They become the biggest party in Germany. They get 37% of the vote. Well, then you're going to be wondering which parties are crashing. Well, it's the parties of the moderate right. The DVP that I just mentioned lost 23 seats. They were reduced down to 7. The DSP, the German State Party of the moderate right, lost 16 seats. They were reduced down to 4. The Christian Social People's Service lost 11 seats. They were down to 3. The Reich Party of the German middle class lost 21 seats and collapsed down to 2.
Jeez.
2 seats in the Reichstag. The Agricultural Party, the Christian National Peasants and Farmers Party, lost 18 seats. They were down to 1 as well. So the parties of the moderate right collapse.
Yeah, and they're voting for
their support evaporates.
And they're voting the people are voting for the Nazis now.
Well, exactly. So which party surges? The Nazis. Which parties collapse?
Yeah. So where are those voters go? Where are they coming from? Where are they going?
They're not going.
Exactly.
The left. The Social Democrats actually lost seats at that election. The left aren't gaining, but the Nazi Party is. So why are millions of conservative Germans switching allegiance between 1930 to 32 to Hitler? Because his party is on the right. They are not voting for the left-wing options.
Yeah.
German conservatives abandon their old parties and move to the National Socialist Party.
Yeah, so these are people already on the right who are just becoming more, they're going further to the right. They're becoming radicalized. They're becoming, they're voting for the more extreme party. So
yeah,
they're not going to the left. Where is this myth coming from?
Well, maybe again we've said point A, the name; point B, the program; point C, perhaps I think for a lot of people who scratch the surface is the economic policies that the Nazis implemented, and them somehow representing either socialism or kind of left-wing politics. And again, I suppose if you were to scratch the surface, perhaps you could argue that point of view. But it just doesn't stand up to proper scrutiny, which again is why no one concludes this. I mean, I think a lot of people point to the fact that the Nazis nationalized certain industries or the state directed parts of the economy. And that is true. But there's a couple of things. Point number one is that they didn't implement socialism. They ran a mixed economy where there was nationalized industry and private enterprise. But so do a lot of countries now and in the past. Yeah. And that doesn't make them socialist states. And that doesn't make their government socialist. So in Nazi Germany, you did have state-owned kind of operations like the Hermann Goering Steelworks or Volkswagen. But you also had BMW, Krupp, Mercedes. You had IG Farben, you had Bayer. You had huge corporations that were not owned by the state. Their profits didn't go to the Nazis. Private enterprise continued. And yes, as the German economy mobilized for war, the government more and more directed the actions of these private companies, said, you've got to make this, whatever. But you see that in countries that fight world wars.
And this still isn't socialism.
Well, no, that isn't socialism either, necessarily. The United States or Britain told private companies in the world wars, you're going to manufacture this, you're going to manufacture that, you're going to use these resources, we're going to control resources coming in and out, we're going to allocate workers. But that doesn't make them socialist states, and that isn't socialism. Let me give you an example from the Second World War. The armaments minister up to 1942 was a guy called Fritz Todt. Now, in 1941, to try and improve the efficiency of the German war economy, which was not very efficient, it must be said, he introduced a fixed prices scheme. And I can imagine these people who argue, oh, fixed prices socialism. Yeah. Well, what it was war production contracts, making, anything, could be rifles, could be uniforms, whatever it might be. They were offered to private companies, and they had to bid with each other at one of three fixed prices for that contract. There was a high fixed price, low fixed price, middle fixed price. And if you went for a low fixed price, there was incentives. There was tax exemptions, things like that. Preferential treatment by the government. So different companies made bids. If it was to build a tank, Porsche might come in and say, well, we'll build this tank for you at the medium price, but Krupp might come in and say, we'll build it for you at the low price. Well, that's not socialism.
Yeah, definitely not. This kind of competition. I mean, it's not.
I mean, you look at an actual socialist economy, the Soviet Union. Did that happen? No, the factories were owned by the state. They weren't owned by Ferdinand Porsche.
Yeah,
they weren't owned by shareholders.
It's not this. It's not this collaboration between the government and private companies.
There was no competition. It was just the Soviet government ordered this factory. You're going to make tanks, and they made tanks. So, living in Nazi Germany, you were living in a mixed economy. There was some state enterprises. There was private enterprises. In fact, most businesses that you would have come across walking along the street in Nazi Germany were not owned by the state. If you lived in a socialist state, well, they were. So I think what people fall into the trap of, and this really gets to the root of it, I think, when you try and engage these people about why were the Nazis socialist, I think it really boils down to these economic policies. Because you can easily debunk the name, you can easily debunk the program, but they will say, oh no, the name and program are valid because of these economic policies they did. Right? But the trouble is, you can mix and match policies all you like. It doesn't prove anything. Because what is a policy? It's a stepping stone to achieve an aim. That's why a government or a party advocates a policy. They want to achieve.
And what is the aim? What's the aim that the Nazi Party is working towards? It's not socialism.
Well, socialism is a philosophy, an ideology that advocates a kind of class equality above all else, isn't it? It's eliminating class inequality. So they would say nationalize private companies so that the bosses don't get rich and we can share out the wealth from everyone. Is that why the Nazis nationalized companies? No, they nationalized companies to better mobilize the economy, in their view, for a war of genocidal conquest, to build an ethno-state based on genocide. Did they construct the Hermann Goering steelworks so that the working classes would be able to share in the profits of big business?
Absolutely not.
No. So the overriding aim of socialism is to either reform or overthrow capitalism in order to achieve class inequality. That's the point of it. That's why they advocate state intervention in the economy. The Nazis were not motivated by a desire to achieve class inequality. That wasn't their aim. That wasn't their fundamental ideology. That wasn't why they nationalized industries. They didn't take over steel production to bring equality between the classes. Like I said, you can mix and match policies all you like. Well, Nixon ran a mixed economy. Britain from the 40s through to the 80s was a mixed economy. China today is a mixed economy. Adolf Hitler had a mixed economy. That doesn't mean they're all the same. Fundamentally, policies of state intervention in the economy don't prove that you belong to a particular ideology.
Exactly. You can have all these different, policies, but if the end goal isn't eliminating class inequality, then it's not socialism.
it's the whole point. It's a stepping stone. A policy is a stepping stone to achieve your aim. But the aim of socialism and the aim of the Nazi Party were worlds apart. They wanted to achieve a racist, vision of of an ethno-state that isn't anything to do with socialism. You can, pick out and say, oh well, the Nazis massively invested in education system.
Doesn't make it socialism.
And Tony Blair, British Prime Minister, massively invested in the education system. It doesn't prove anything. Mix and match, that's fine. But why were they doing it? Tony Blair did it because this aspirational idea of it doesn't matter where you're born, you're going to have the same life chances. The Nazis' overhaul of the education system was about indoctrination and preparing the youth for their future roles in their vision of society, improving racial hygiene by, teaching them PE twice a day so they'd be fit and healthy warriors of the future. Just because they did a similar policy doesn't mean they were trying to achieve the same thing. Therefore, doesn't mean that they had the same ideology. I mean, the other point is, that's one part of the Nazi policy. That's one part of socialist policy. But they didn't do any of the other parts of socialist policy. They didn't, like we said, strip the wealthy of their land or capital. They didn't institute worker control. They didn't mention class. In fact, they deliberately tried to stamp out class identity. So if it's not about the class struggle, you're left thinking, well, what's left that is socialist?
And the answer...
I mean, I see some people talking about bringing everyone together, collective effort, everyone working together for the state, and saying that's the same as socialism. Well, yeah, but nationalism and even conservatism, you could say, is about bringing the people together in a common purpose, uniting them under the flag. So again, and that's not the fundamental of socialism. Why are socialists trying to bring everyone together? It's so that everyone will be equal. It's not so that you can create a racial state.
Yeah, I mean, nationalists will unite everyone together so that you're united to fight against whatever enemy you're going to be fighting against. It's not socialism. It's not. They're not working towards it.
You've got to ask why are they doing it, not what are they doing. You've got to ask why, because you could say, oh well, Ted Heath, British Prime Minister in the 70s, nationalised the Clydeside shipyards. Well, was he trying to achieve an ethno-state? No. Was he trying to achieve equality between all the classes? No. I mean, think about the 2008 crisis. Many countries around the world nationalised the banks.
Yeah.
They rescued banks in safety by buying them up and absorbing their debt. That happened in America, that happened in Britain, that happened across the world. Were they doing it to create a class-free society where everyone's equal? No. So it wasn't socialism. No one says that when the banks were nationalised in 2008, it was socialism. So why, when the Nazis nationalised things, is it necessarily socialism? Equally, the banks weren't nationalised to help mobilise the economy for a war of conquest in order to carry out mass genocide. Yeah. So nationalising the banks was not Nazi either.
So, if we've come to the conclusion that this isn't socialism, why do people want continuously, and you see this everywhere, why do people constantly want to tie Nazis to leftist ideology? Why do they constantly want to tie the Nazis to being socialist?
I think the reason behind it, I think fundamentally, you won't find anyone who's left-wing who thinks the Nazis are left-wing. But I think, without wanting to beat around the bush, I think the people who do believe this misconception tend to be right-wing. And I think the reason they do it is because they are kind of sick of being tarred with the same brush, sick of being criticized as fascist or Nazi. Now, they kind of want to throw back the label and say, oh, well, actually, look, the things they believed in are the things you believe in at their political opponents. Now, at the end of the day, hopefully the kind of points we've made show why that just isn't the case. And it doesn't matter what stance you have politically. I mean, Boris Johnson last year, when he was trying to force through Brexit in Britain, got very frustrated with Parliament. Parliament, he lost vote after vote in Parliament. And he ended up giving a quote saying something like, I think the British people feel that this Parliament has outlived its usefulness. Now, you could stand there and say, well, that's a very fascist thing to say. It's actually pretty reminiscent of some of the things Hitler would say about democracy. But at the end of the day, what was he talking about? What was his aim? Well, it wasn't actually to achieve a fascist or Nazi goal. He ended up calling a general election, and a new parliament was formed that actually was to his liking. And I'd have as much, as the next man. I don't have any, belief that, because he said that Boris Johnson is a Nazi. But I think because that gets thrown at the right, then some people on the right get prickly about it and kind of want to throw it back. What I would say is that the reason it gets thrown at the right is to some extent, our point about it being about your aims. That's how you work out someone's ideology. So the people on the far right fringes of modern Western politics, when we think about what are their aims, well, they tend to be around, basically centered around racism.
Yeah.
And removing certain races, ethnicities, or religions from the nation because they have a negative view of that race or religion or ethnic group and think that somehow they undermine the national life of the country and therefore they need to be, forced out. I'm not saying necessarily they believe in genocide, let's hope not.
Yeah.
But they say that we need to stop them getting in, we need to force them out. Now, that's why people might call them fascists or Nazis, because their aims, their worldview, it is in some ways comparable. The fundamental aims and worldview of the left are completely different to that. They're not based on race. They're not based on ethnicity.
Yeah.
That's why the comparisons are made between the modern far right and fascism or Nazism, because the aims underlying these groups bear some similarities. I'm not saying that it's entirely accurate, but they might bear some similarities.
But tying the Nazi Party to the left is absurd.
I mean, it is. And I think one of the ways you can see that is by what happened at the time. At the time, there wasn't really any debate about whether the Nazis were left-wing or right-wing. The Nazis existed on the far right of German politics, and no one was really confused about that fact.
Yeah.
Like we mentioned in the very first episode about Erich Ludendorff, possibly the most right-wing person you could ever imagine. He became an ally of the Nazi Party, and the Nazis backed him in the 1925 presidential election. The Nazis, in the early days, in the early 20s, when they were quite a small movement, allied themselves with lots of other far-right groups, Volkisch groups. The Volkisch Freedom Party, an organization of paramilitaries called the Kampfbund. Why would they do that if they were left-wing? Why would they ally themselves with racist far-right groups? Why would they ally themselves with Erich Ludendorff?
Yeah, well, it's because they're right-wing. And like you say, at the time, there is no debate. you know.
Yeah. I mean, later on, when they get more established, they were more aligned with there was a kind of organization called the Hartsburg Front, often termed the National Opposition, which was far-right groups, the DNVP party I mentioned before, led by a guy called Alfred Hugenberg, who was almost like the Weimar Germany's Rupert Murdoch. He was a far-right nationalist media magnate who owned loads of newspapers, loads of kind of the big film studio, for example, in Germany at the time. They allied themselves in this Hartsburg Front with the Pan-German League, a racist organization. They aligned themselves with the Stahlhelm, a right-wing veterans association from the First World War. Again, they didn't have to form this alliance. There was left-wing parties in Germany at the time they could have formed an alliance with. But they chose to form an alliance with right-wing groups and far-right groups. And then equally, once they came into power, they actually, came into power as in a coalition government appointed by the conservative president, Paul von Hindenburg. A coalition with the DNVP, with Stahlhelm members, with ex-members of the Catholic Party. It was a right-wing coalition. No one was in doubt about that. No one was... there wasn't a press conference where people were saying to President Hindenburg, why have you appointed these mad left-wing socialists?
Exactly.
You're a massive conservative. Why are you doing this? No one was going up to Alfred Hugenberg saying, you're betraying your nationalist roots. Why are you suddenly siding with the left? Well, no one thought that the Nazis were left-wing.
Exactly. And so, but when, modern political discourse... you hear this. You hear the label, the Nazis were leftist, thrown around all the time, but it's only a modern perspective. I don't know when this school of thought has come about.
No, it's mysterious. I mean, you then look, once they're in power, the international alliances the Nazis made, who did they ally with?
People like Franco, people like Mussolini. Undoubtedly on the right.
Japan.
Oh, yeah.
The Hungarian dictatorship of Admiral Horthy, Romania, which was a far-right dictatorship. They didn't make alliances with left-wing countries.
Oh, the Japanese. There
was the Nazi-Soviet pact, but each of them hated each other, and there's no doubt each hated each other. And it was always very
the Japanese
temporary.
Empire, that famous communist, socialist, country.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't Hoi 4. Japan was not a communist nation. Did Franco, when he buddied up with the Nazis, were the press conferences, the Daily Mail journalists interviewing, saying, now, we support your views, but why on earth are you allying yourselves with those leftists, the Nazis?
Well, yeah, I mean, so let's say that this sets a precedent that if we're calling the Nazis leftists, then this sets a precedent for every other right-wing political party in any nation across the world. That makes World War II just leftist infighting. That makes the Spanish Civil War just leftist infighting, because you're moving the goalposts.
I mean, yeah. I mean, so then what are you saying, that the United States and Britain were the far right coming in?
How far right, if that's the case, how far right are we compared to, or how far left are we compared to how far left the Nazis are? I want to see that political spectrum.
I mean, if the Nazis were left-wing, why, when they came to power, was there no flight of capital? Were there not aristocrats fleeing the country? You had that in Russia. You had that, in lots of countries that go socialist. You have flight of capital, big business, wealthy individuals leave. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. Who left? Well, Jews and left-wingers.
I feel like, we've raised these points, and I just feel like there's going to be some people out there who are just going to say, oh, this is just anecdotal. Doesn't matter.
The thing is, we've talked about their collaboration with other rightists, which they did throughout their existence. Once they're in power, throughout their time in government, actually, there was members of the cabinet who were not Nazis, but who were conservatives or nationalists. Hugenberg was one of them, Franz von Papen. Papen served the Nazi regime right up to 1945 in different ambassadorships, for example. Like, would they have appointed him to these powerful positions if they were left-wing? I mean, if they were incredibly generous. And that, funnily enough, the Nazis are not known for their generosity. So why did they tolerate all these establishment conservatives? Did they ever invite any left-wingers into their government? Could you remind me?
Let me think back, way back in my memory bank here. No.
No. When they set up puppet states in quite a few different countries that they conquered, for example, France, did they invite the local socialists to form a government?
No, I don't remember anything like that.
No, it was conservatives, nationalists, fascists. And if the Nazis truly were left-wing, then that just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Yeah. Why would all of their friendships, all of their alliances, all of the people they collaborated with be right-wing?
Yeah.
And none be left-wing?
I mean, it's simple. It's a...
The answer is very
incredibly simple. I feel like there is a bit of an effort to kind of change the political spectrum, to change the way that we think about, the compass. And when you do that, I mean, you completely, you lose the ground we're standing on. Because of course, if you do that, then yeah, okay, sure. In your eyes, the Nazis are leftist, okay? But what does that mean?
Yeah, it's totally irrelevant. Like, it doesn't get you anywhere. You've not proved anything, and you've not.
You're just saying, you're just saying words. You're just saying, oh, the Nazis are leftist, and it's it's to kind of tie bad people to the leftist label.
It's demonstrably untrue, and the irony is, there's terrible left-wing people out there. You could
exactly,
you could easily go after some socialist and communist regimes that have done terrible things. You don't need to assign the Nazis in order for there to be guilt.
Yeah,
I mean, I saw a point raised about this, which was, it's so funny when people say evidence of the Nazis not being left-wing was that they murdered communists and socialists in Germany.
I mean,
have they never heard of the gulags before? And the Soviet Union definitely purged non-party line leftists. Yeah. But the Nazis banned and wiped out, either through mass imprisonment, mass murder, the left in Germany, and actually, around Europe as well. You had thousands of exiled Spanish Republicans ended up in concentration camps in Germany and Austria, which, if they were left-wing, the Nazis, it seems really weird why they would want to lock up Spanish left-wingers. Like, they just wouldn't bother, would they? But do you see them locking up conservatives, locking up, nationalists? Well, no. People might, at this point, raise, well, actually, the people who make this argument won't, because they just won't know enough about the topic. But they might raise the Night of the Long Knives, where the Nazis purged Ernst Röhm, Gregor Strasser, and a few dissidents of the Nazi Party.
This is not, if they raise this is not they don't have a leg to stand on.
Well, yeah, it's as simple as that. It was not an ideological difference. There was disagreements within the Nazi Party, for sure. Some people, like Ernst Röhm, wanted more social change. But what happened to him? He got shot. Did the Nazis bring about social change? No. They didn't take land off the wealthy. They didn't take businesses off the wealthy. So, not only that, but you can get into complexities about the fact really behind it all was actually a Nazi Party power struggle about Himmler and Goering wanting to get rid of Röhm as being too powerful, etc., etc., etc. You can talk about all that separately if you actually know enough about the topic. But it wasn't a case of, well, there was actually loads of Nazis who were really left-wing. It wasn't. Gregor Strasser is often held up. He wasn't left-wing. He wasn't left-wing. Yes, he advocated more of the revolutionary element of the Nazi program, but actually even that is overstated to some extent. And above all else, he was loyal to the Fuhrer. And the reason he was killed was because it was rumoured back in 1932 he was going to form a coalition without Hitler. So I think if we get to the root of it all, it's because these people who might hold this misconception have scratched the surface. And they have not studied it in depth. There is, like I've said, no historian, no political scientist who's written about the Nazi Party and considers them to be left-wing. They're universally seen as a right-wing, far-right, ultra-nationalist group. And yes, they use nationalisation policies. And yes, they use some anti-capitalist rhetoric. But what was their aim? What was their belief? What was their ideology? It wasn't anything to do with the class struggle.
I just really would like to know, how this keeps surviving as a means of argument. And I mean, it's the internet, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, that's, I think, how it gets the oxygen, this misconception. Because people who are not experts in this field can share their view on an equal platform. And ultimately, if a YouTuber says that the Nazis were left-wing, people will feel an emotional connection to that. That's part of the appeal of the internet, I think. And things like YouTube and Twitch streamers and things like that is you feel like you have some sort of connection to the person. And because it's almost like a friend saying it, they agree with it.
Yeah.
I think we wanted to end the episode by unpicking what might be regarded as one of the sources of this misconception. I managed to stumble across a book, and it's actually from a bit earlier than I was anticipating. It's from 2008.
Yeah,
and it was a bestseller, which might explain some of the reasons why this view has become more prevalent in the last decade or so. And the book is called Liberal Fascism, The Secret History of the American Left from Mussolini to the Politics of Meaning by a guy called Jonah Goldberg.
Liberal fascism.
Peter.
Yeah, yes?
Do you think Jonah Goldberg is a scholar of fascism?
The title of the book is Liberal Fascism. What's the subtitle again?
The Secret History of the American Left from Mussolini to the Politics of Meaning.
No.
Yeah, you're right. He's a columnist. He's an opinion writer. He's not an expert. Simple as that.
I mean, all right. But he's written a book on.
Oh, but
he's written a book about it. He's written a whole big old book.
Now, trying to understand it, I've done a few things. I've looked at some reviews of this book. I've looked at extracts from the book. I've looked at well, I'll tell you. One of the reviews of the book said, "Look, I went into it open-minded, and I think, I ended up agreeing with him because I think people who disagree are clearly closed-minded." One of the reasons this review said that, it was just a member of the public, it wasn't an academic review by any stretch, was that, well, it's very well researched. And it's got loads of notes, the numbers, and at the end it says where the information came from.
So if it has a lot of those.
And that intrigued me. I thought, well, let's have a look. So I've looked through the notes pages of this book. And what he's done is he's referenced quite a lot of histories, quite a lot of historians. And he has come to the completely different conclusion of the historians that he's read.
Oh, all right.
Which is interesting and confusing. Well, actually not confusing. what's happened is he's done something that historians know you should never do, which is come up with a thesis, come up with a view, and then find the evidence to fit it. Historians want to investigate something, they want to understand something, they want to study something, but you've got to professionally do your absolute best to try and put any preconceptions you have out of your mind. Obviously, it's not possible entirely, but you've got to go within it, that professional approach. And you've got to let the evidence lead you and the scholarship lead you, the other historians who've studied this. He references quite a few times a book by Stanley Payne, who's a conservative historian primarily of Spain, actually. I actually disagree with Stanley Payne about quite a lot of points. But Stanley Payne is one of the top scholars of fascism in the modern world. And he's written a book, History of Fascism. And that book very clearly makes the point that matching policies does not equal the same ideology.
Wow.
It says that the fascist economic policies, government intervention, nationalization, does not make those, wanting those things make you a fascist or a Nazi. So he's taken what this book argues and basically used it as his reference, but come to the complete opposite conclusion.
It's like, he's looking for references or something, and he's finding these things out of context or something.
I mean, some of the notes come up with things that I find completely bizarre. I mean, he claims that the Nazis were not social Darwinists. And interesting, this note contains no reference. No author he can find backs this up. This is just his own opinions. So the reference is just his own note of social Darwinism means survival of the fittest in an anarchic free-for-all of capitalist predation. And he basically says that was Herbert Spencer's view. Now, Herbert Spencer is considered the father of social Darwinism, but he's also considered a racist and associated with the far right. And he therefore says that Nazism is the opposite of social Darwinism, because the Nazis believe the state should pick the winners and losers with welfare. And that means that they were, he uses this exact word, exactly the opposite position of those we call social Darwinists.
But how is that arguing against liberalism, though?
First of all, social Darwinism doesn't necessarily mean free-for-all capitalism. It can be applied in different ways. Second of all, he can't find any historian of social Darwinism to back this up, this claim. And thirdly, the historical consensus very much is that the Nazis were social Darwinists. They specifically applied it not to capitalism, but to race, and said that some races were superior to others. Now, that was, Herbert Spencer said that as well. So the idea that Herbert Spencer was a free-for-all capitalist and didn't have any racial prejudice, he's literally just made up. There is a chapter about Woodrow Wilson called The Birth of Liberal Fascism.
Okay.
And the quotes, the references, the historians, none of them are about the fact that Wilson was fascist. There's plenty of histories of Wilson. But what he's doing is he's picking out quotes or policies that match to fascism. He's then got, for me, the most extraordinary one, Franklin Roosevelt's Fascist New Deal. And a whole load of references of histories of FDR, histories of the New Deal. Again, none of which are ones saying that he was
I don't
a
think you
fascist.
can find a historian out there that will try and make the case that FDR was a fascist. I mean,
and I see a lot of this idea that state intervention equals fascism seems to completely ignore Keynesianism, the economics of John Maynard Keynes from the same time period. No, he wasn't a socialist. He was an economist. He was a capitalist, but he advocated a theory of using state intervention to protect your country from the worst ravages of the boom and bust effect of capitalism. Now, whatever you think of Keynesianism, it isn't socialism. It isn't about the things that socialism is about, that we've set out very clearly in this episode. And the policies of FDR's New Deal, economic stimulus, pumping money into the economy through various means, public works programs, things like that. Yep, you can say fascists did that. The Nazis did that. But this is the whole mix and match thing again. Can you find a historian who says that Roosevelt was a fascist? Can you find a historian who says the New Deal was a fascist policy? Well, I mean, yes, it had some similarities. But, you know, you're then going to say all the economic stimulus programs that were seen post the crash of 2008, were they all
Was the point of the
well?
New Deal to, you know, work towards an ethno-state?
It is literally a whole book of this mix and match, which is totally irrelevant.
Yeah, it doesn't hold up.
It doesn't hold up at all. You know, ideology is about your worldview, your beliefs, your aims, your objectives, what you envision, you envisage, for society. It's not about, you know, the policies are the means, the way you achieve it. It's not the ends. I mean, let's end the episode, I think, with a laugh, shall we? Let's read the blurb to liberal fascism. Fascists, brown shirts, jack-booted stormtroopers. Such are the insults typically hurled at conservatives by their liberal opponents. Calling someone a fascist is the fastest way to shut them up, defining their views as beyond the political pale. But who are the real fascists in our midst? Liberal fascism offers a startling new perspective on the theories and practices that define fascist politics. Replacing conveniently manufactured myths with surprising and enlightening research, Jonah Goldberg reminds us that the original fascists were really on the left, and that liberals, from Woodrow Wilson to FDR to Hillary Clinton, have advocated policies and principles remarkably similar to those of Hitler's National Socialism and Mussolini's fascism. Contrary to what most people think, the Nazis were ardent socialists, hence the term National Socialism. Let's not get into that. They believed in free healthcare and guaranteed jobs. They confiscated inherited wealth and spent vast sums on public education. They purged the church from public policy, promoted a new form of pagan spirituality, and inserted the authority of the state into every nook and cranny of daily life. The Nazis declared war on smoking, supported abortion, euthanasia, and gun control. They loathed the free market, provided generous pensions for the elderly, maintained a strict racial quota system in their universities, where campus speech codes were all the rage. The Nazis led the world in organic farming and alternative medicine. Hitler was a strict vegetarian, and Himmler was an animal rights activist.
I'm sorry. Continue.
Do these striking parallels mean that today's liberals are genocidal maniacs intent on conquering the world and imposing a new racial order? Not at all. It's hard to deny that modern progressivism and classical fascism share the same intellectual roots. We often forget, for example, that Mussolini and Hitler had many admirers in the United States. I'm not going to continue.
What do you say?
His argument, I'll sum up the rest of it, is basically that although in Germany fascism took on a genocidal form, in America it took on a friendlier, liberal form. The quintessential fascist isn't an SS stormtrooper, it is a female grade school teacher with an education degree from Brown or Swarthmore.
What are you talking about? I think that's so... can I just say, linking Hitler being a vegetarian and Himmler being an animal rights activist to liberalism and leftism, I mean, I can't. That's astounding.
Well, I have seen this advocated before, and maybe it's come from this book. The idea that the Nazis were big on animal rights. Oh, Hitler was a vegetarian, therefore they were left wing. Well, first of all, vegetarianism
That's not.
Although maybe there's a Venn diagram, it's not.
It's not linked to ideology at its core. It is something.
And secondly, Hitler didn't force the German people to be
exactly
vegetarians, and his own vegetarianism, was not exactly strict. It says here. I mean, there's times in his life where he definitely did eat meat and drank alcohol, despite everyone saying he was a teetotaler. And Himmler being an animal rights activist, I mean, is that really what we remember him for? If you read a biography of Himmler by a historian, is it going to have a big section about his animal rights work? No, because it was not a big part of his policy position. How many animals did he save?
Heinrich Himmler, famous animal rights activist and head of the SS.
I think a lot of these people confuse animal rights activist with animal lover. Which, if you judge on some Twitter bios from mental right-wing nutcases that often say, love my country, love my family, love my dog, shows you that you don't have to be left-wing
exactly.
to like animals.
Liking animals, being vegetarian, it's not linked to political spectrum. Look at the people on the right, look at the people on the left. Is there any correlation between vegetarianism and political identity? I don't think there is.
Yeah, I mean, you can have some people, extremist Islam. Well, extreme Islamists won't drink alcohol, but that doesn't mean they're on the left. The things about, pagan spirituality, about, the things like this, they're very small parts of the Nazi party as a whole. Most Nazis were not pagans, and most Germans throughout the Nazi period were church-going Christians, or at least, even if they didn't go to church, were Christian. The Nazi and to associate paganism with modern liberalism is also very strange.
It's such a reach.
To say they shared the same intellectual roots is completely bizarre to me, and I don't think there's any real evidence for that. Like I said, Nazism grew out of Volkish far-right German politics in the late 1910s. Very specific time and place. Modern liberalism didn't grow out of German far-right Volkish politics, I'm afraid. It just didn't.
Like a modern. Let's say ask a modern like liberal scholar. Who's your inspiration? Otto von Bismarck.
Yeah, I mean, didn't like smoking. I mean, smoking was absolutely, ubiquitous in Europe at the time. And that is to do with, I mean, as if also being against smoking is a negative position. That's what it's implying here. But being against smoking, if the Nazis did, and I'm not sure they were big on that at all, because, the Nazis smoked, German soldiers smoked. But anyway, that would have been about the health of the race, which is it's not exactly why people today say you shouldn't smoke. To reserve the pure Aryan race.
You shouldn't be smoking. You're harming that pure Aryan body of yours.
I mean, some of them are just like downright inaccurate comparisons, like things like gun control.
Yeah.
There's it's not a relevant comparison. It's such a different context and time. Europe throughout the period then and now has not had widespread gun ownership and has had strict gun rules. That isn't a Nazi policy.
Yeah.
That's before, during, and after the Nazis. Things like the idea that, the same applies to the healthcare one. Again, well, that's just normal in Europe to have healthcare and welfare. These things were brought in before the Nazis.
Yeah.
And they continued through the Nazi period because they weren't going to take those things away from their citizens, because they were normal things seen in the context of Europe at the time. And they have continued afterwards. They're not, the Nazi were not like public health kind of crusaders who said, everyone's got to have healthcare. These were systems that were introduced in the Bismarckian era, in the Weimar era of widespread public welfare. the idea about euthanasia, I find quite offensive, to be honest. That point is really quite offensive. And the same for the racial quota in universities. Well, euthanasia, the advocates of euthanasia today are talking about people with terminal illness or locked-in syndrome, things like this, wanting to end their own life. The Nazis carried out euthanasia programs against the, the disabled, the mentally ill, people with hereditary conditions, people who were seen as racially weak, who were going to weaken the stock of the Aryan race by reproducing. I mean, to compare those two...
it's disingenuous, and yeah, you're right, it is offensive.
And to compare, I guess what they're talking about is positive discrimination today around things like university admission to try and increase the number of people from ethnic minorities getting into university, is being compared to the Nazis banning Jews from going to university.
I mean, it doesn't hold up.
Strict racial quota system.
What?
I mean, if you just sit back for a second and think about that, how offensive and how genuinely horrible and conceited do you have to be to make that comparison and say, oh well, the Nazis banning Jews and other racial groups, the Roma, Sinti people, things like this, from public life. Well, that's like how people now try and get more ethnic minority people to go to university.
Comparing, one is to increase diversity. The other is banning Jews from going to university. How do you make that conclusion? You can't just say that and not have anything to back it up. I mean, I don't know what's in the book. But I mean, if he's trying to make a comparison, if he's trying to say that these are the same things, then he doesn't have a leg to stand on.
And at the end of the day, all of these things are the mix and match of policies,
which we describe.
All his points, all his arguments, which is silly. I mean, we could do a mix and match of policies of Nazi Germany with modern conservatives, and I'm sure we could find a lot. But it doesn't prove that modern conservatives are Nazis.
You said let's end it on a laugh. I'm just more angry than I was before.
Yeah, I thought that would be quite funny, and in a way it is funny.
It's funny because all you can kind of do is kind of laugh at the absurdity of it. But at the same time, when you consider the fact that this is the kind of this is literature which is being passed around. I mean, like you said, it's a book, it's a bestseller, and I mean, it's just bad history. And it's being, these ideas are being spread around on the internet, and
it's fundamentally it seems to be, well, it's bad history, as you're rightly saying, but no historians advocate this point of view, which is crucial. I mean, no one who actually studies it with any rigor. Like I said, I mean, we're not going to claim to be world-leading historians, but we've listed so many reasons here why you can say the Nazis definitely weren't left-wing.
I mean, I'm not a historian. I'm not a massive expert on history, but I can tell you, go look at people who are. Go find people who are, listen to them, and if they don't have anything to...
And unfortunately, Jonah Goldberg appears to have looked at them and come to the exact contradictory conclusion. And it is worrying in a way that it's a bestseller, and the reviews online, you look at Amazon, are overwhelmingly positive. And I think, some of this clearly has spawned this kind of more widespread idea that you see mainly on the internet, but it is worrying because, look, the reason the Nazis are taught so widely is because it's such an important lesson from history. So to fundamentally misunderstand it in such a basic way, to have such a huge misconception, and is a worry, is a concern. And you know what, I hope there are at least one or two people out there who maybe thought this before and have actually managed to listen to the end without just saying, oh, they're wrong, switching it off. And maybe convinced. I mean, if we do a quick TLDR, what are our essential points?
Well, that policy does not equal, a political ideology. That you can mix and match policies all you want. It doesn't make it socialist. It doesn't make it fascist.
I think crucially, we've got to say their name, their program is part of a trend, and you've got to actually look at whether they put it into practice, which they didn't. But it's part of a trend in the very specific context of a time and place. Who voted for them? Who joined the party? Who established the party?
Who did they ally themselves with? The Nazis.
Who did they ally themselves with? Who were willing to work with them? The answer to all those questions is right-wing people. I mean, that alone should be enough to kind of prove it if you want, because why would they never work with left-wing people? Why would they never be allies with the left if they were on the left? I can't think of many left-wing groups that choose right-wing allies. Can't think of many right-wing voters who choose a radical left party. And fundamentally, like I think we've said, it's about their ideology, it's about their beliefs, their worldview, their aims, what they've envisaged for society. And that was a genocidal vision of, conquest to create an ethnically pure state. Now, is that socialism? Is that achieving class equality? Is that overthrowing capitalism? No. Therefore, the Nazis were not socialist.
I mean, that's pretty much.
And
they certainly were not left wing. That's pretty much all we have to say. And like you said, I mean, my hope is that there's someone out there who has listened to this, or even if you haven't listened to the whole thing, my hope is, well, if you didn't listen to the whole thing, you wouldn't be hearing this part right now, but you understand the sentiment.
And look, if you come across somebody online or otherwise advocating this point of view, maybe link them to this episode.
Link them to this episode, or try and tell them some of the things that we've said in this to show.
Yeah, look, if you can come back at us with evidence of why the Nazis, who were supposedly left-wing, worked with only people on the right, if you can come back with us evidence of why so many conservative Germans started voting for a radical left party, if you can come back with us for evidence of how the Nazis tried to go about achieving socialism, i.e. class equality, a utopian vision of a society without rich and poor, again, please do provide us with that evidence.
We'd like to hear it.
I think you're going to struggle, though, because historians have worked on this for 80 years.
Yeah, it's been a while. It's been a while. There's been a lot of research on it, and no accepted historian believes this. So, hey,
right.
Think of that as a challenge, I guess.
Yeah, I suppose so. Well, I have been
And
Alex.
I have been Peter, and thank you for listening to this rambly, discussion-y episode of History's Most. We'll see you in the next one.
We hope
you have enjoyed.